Hello students, we have already discussed the meaning and nature of international relations. Now we will discuss about the scope. We will be just starting our discussion with a very small question. Can we really fix the scope of the discipline which we consider as a very dynamic discipline? We will be discussing this question in different ways. First we will be talking of the traditional agenda that define the scope of international relations. Then we will be talking of some recent developments, how that affected the scope of international relations. Then we will be talking of the scope under which we will include the role of actors, role of institutions, structures, processes and particular episodes. Then we will be ending our discussion with certain concluding points. Now let us start with the first basic question, that can we really fix the scope of the discipline which we consider as a very dynamic discipline? The word scope is a very dangerously ambiguous word, because when you talk of the scope of international relations or maybe for any other social science discipline, it suggests that the subject matter has demarcated limits and one can trace out those limits. So, it is not possible, particularly for a dynamic discipline like ours or like international relations. So, one cannot settle the subject matter of a discipline, as it tends to vary with time and emergence of new conditions and factors. We have already discussed how important the role of international events were there for the evolution and growth of the discipline, how the discipline's agenda is changing, how the discipline's nomenclature is changing, how some are calling it international politics, some said it is international relations, some are saying it is global politics. So, everything is changing, and particularly for our discipline that depends a lot on global arena, that is a very difficult question for our discipline. This issue will be clear once we compare the traditional and contemporary agenda of our discipline. So, what has been the traditional agenda and what has been the contemporary agenda? So, once we compare and contrast, then we will come to the conclusion whether we can really fix the scope of our discipline. So, let us start with the traditional agenda of international relations. Under the traditional agenda, IR became the study of states and interstate relationship. We have already discussed this, that how the scholars who were studying international politics or international relations in the 1950s and 60s, they basically believed that the international relations they defined was basically the study of states and interstate relationship. States were assumed to have authority over their political space. Sometimes we call it as territorial trap, reinforced by sovereignty. So, basically states were ruling on their specified geographical territory, and the principle on the basis of which they were ruling was sovereignty, or the power by virtue of which the states were considered as independent both domestically and internationally. So, these two principles, this territorial supremacy and the principle of sovereignty, that defined the nature of nation states. States, territory and authority became tightly coupled in international relations. So, those who studied international relations, those who studied about the state system, they were focusing on these three issues, particularly the state, territory and authority. The anarchy narrative focused how self-interested states pursue their security and welfare under a condition of anarchy that makes cooperation desirable but difficult. So, the anarchical principle under which the states were operating, that referred to the absence of an overarching global authority that could control the selfish behavior of the states, that was not there, and that is why the principle of anarchy was there at the international level, and the states were operating within this anarchical system. The Great Divide pointed out towards the traditional agenda of high politics, that is the diplomatic and strategic issues like the arms issue, the power issue, the balance of power, the kind of power distribution. So, basically they were talking of high politics, and they were not interested for the low politics that we associate with domestic politics, that we associate with domestic trade issues, economic issues or some other issue. So, there was a clear demarcation between domestic politics and international politics, and the traditional agenda basically gave importance to the international issue. states became the principal actors and focus was concentrated on issues pertaining to their external relations. Because there was a divide between the domestic issues and international issues, so states were basically concerned about the international issues that related to their foreign policy. So, they were not concerned about the domestic issues that could influence the international issues or international policy. Issues of military power, security, arms control, war, diplomacy and great power relations were all studied under the scope of international politics. So, once you make a distinction between domestic politics and international politics, you are making the issue very clear that these are international issues, these are domestic issues, and the traditional agenda of international politics was basically covering those issues that they considered as an important part of international issue. While anarchy, territorial trough and great divide narrative illuminated some issues, it also dismissed and obscured many other important issues. So, once you make a distinction between the domestic issue and the international issue, or the domestic sphere and the international sphere, then you may be saying something that is really great, but on the other hand you are underestimating or you are not revealing some of the other important issues that could have an important implications for international politics. Little attention to domestic politics, that anything that did not fit neatly into the agenda of states, war and law considered as irrelevant. So, those who particularly focus on this international politics, they were thinking that international issue or international politics is very important, and any domestic issue that is not important or that is not explaining the operation of international politics, that was not relevant. Little appreciation of increasingly rule bound nature of the decentralized global governance system. So, particularly they were not talking of global governance, they were talking of some loose kind of rules and regulations which the states sometimes obey, they do not obey. It all depended on the nature of power distribution in the international system. So, if you are a powerful state, you may obey something, you may not obey something. If you are a small state, if you are a less powerful state, then you are bound to follow those rules. So, we have seen that in many examples, in case of Iraq, in case of Kuwait, in case of Ukraine, we have seen that. So, the non-state actors recognized, but state centric focus was justified on the grounds that they are either captured by the states or simply irrelevant. So, we have already discussed this issue that when the states were considered as important actors in international politics, when a lot of effort was made to explain the interstate relations, there were non-state actors also operating in the international system, but they were not considered very important because states were the primary actors, although they were accepting the role of the non-state actors, but they were not considered at par with the state actors, or they were not considered very relevant to explain the operation of international politics. So, there was also very little attention to important global trends and issues. So, they were not concerned that like the way we are today concerned, what are the global trends, how that can influence the working of international politics, what are the important global issues that could require global cooperation, that was important. Basically, the traditional focused on political issues, on military issues, on some other issues that was related to interstate action or interaction, but they were not focusing on issues that was not relevant for the state interaction. So, that was the main focus of traditional agenda. Now, let me explain some recent developments that have seriously expanded the scope of international relations and how they are considered as an important factor that could explain present scope of our discipline. The end of the Cold War era and the process of globalization have rewritten the rules of global politics in some important ways. Just remember how the Second World War that affected international politics in a substantial way. So, similarly, you can understand the end of the Cold War and the process of globalization for their important implications for the way we understand international politics, for the way we analyze international politics. Relations among states remain vital, but transnational and supranational actors are also important in the global actors. So, the present view basically considers the role of state actors as well as the non-state actors. International companies, especially the rating agencies, for example, the Standard and Poor, the Moody, the Brickwork, which rates debtors on the basis of their ability to pay debt back, assess the creditworthiness of companies and states. So now the state's credit rating is decided by non-state actors. You must have seen that how the positive rating of the companies or a particular country can influence its stock market, and if there is a negative rating for any company or country, that also creates a lot of problem for its stock market. And I will just give another example, although it is a very different example, how a little known company, or sometimes you can call it as a research entity, how that published a report on the working and the economic manipulation made by the Adanis, and how that created a kind of economic disaster for the Adani enterprises, and how that also created a lot of problem in our economy. So that explains we should not take these non-state entities very seriously, because their report, their credit worthiness, their ranking, they are all important, not just for similar companies, but also for some nation states. Policies of international organizations such as the IMF and World Bank towards other countries is another example. You must have seen how the countries like Sri Lanka, like Pakistan, they are in a poor economic condition, and how they are seeking loan from this International Monetary Fund, and what are the conditions they are required to follow, and unless and until they follow these conditions, they will not be given any loan. So that explains that that how powerful these international organizations have become, and how they are dictating the policies towards the sovereign country. Economic power is now more important than military power. Again, I can give you the example of Pakistan and North Korea. These two countries, they are definitely militarily powerful. They are considered as nuclear weapon states. But see their economic position. Unless and until you are economically powerful, you will be dependent on other countries, as North Koreans are dependent on China, or Pakistan is dependent on China, Saudi Arabia, and many other countries in the West Asia. So that explains that even if you are militarily powerful, unless and until you have a strong economic capability, you cannot be considered as a powerful nation internationally. The concept of security has also undergone a sea change. The military security is now considered just one aspect of state security. So earlier we were thinking of security in different way. We were giving primary importance to military security. So now you see how the concept of security is undergoing a kind of transformation. How we are talking of national security in relation to common security. We are talking of comprehensive national security. We are talking of global security. So the concept of national security, that you just focused on your own nation and you are not bothering about others, so that has become outdated. The concept of human security shifts the notion of security from a state centric standpoint to a citizen centric perspective. So the point is, earlier conception of security has become outdated, although not fully, but at least we are giving importance to other dimensions of state security. We are also giving importance to other perceptions of security or other conceptions of security, particularly making individual at the starting point. International human rights networks can exert pressure on states to help bring them changes in political systems to protect various rights. So now you see the research organizations, the non-political entities, they are bringing their report time to time and rating the democratic record of a particular country, the human rights record of a particular country, and the countries like like North Korea, like China, those who are considered as totalitarian countries, they are also taking those reports seriously when they make statement or when they deny these reports. So that explains that we are living at a time when we can't say that human rights is our domestic issue, or these issues have nothing to do with others. So you have to respect international law, you have to respect international norms, and that is how you operate in the international system. Global telecommunications and multinational businesses integrate economies. At the same time, terrorism and conflicts undermine state sovereignty both from within and without. So, we should not forget that that the process of globalization on the one hand is integrating the countries, integrating the societies, but at the same time there are some problems with new issues like terrorism or maybe intrastate conflicts that undermine the state sovereignty, which the scholars of international politics and international relations considered so dear. Multilateralism coexists with trends towards regional cooperation, as we can see in case of the European Union and ASEAN. So, on the one hand states are giving importance to multilateralism, at the same time the supranational organizations such as the European Union or ASEAN, they are also facilitating regional integration of the states within a particular geographical boundary. While the traditional agenda focused on system of states, the new agenda on growing influence of global actors, structures and processes. So, we can compare that how the traditional agenda focused on the state system and the state interaction, but how the new agenda is focusing on the growing influence of global actors, particularly the state actors, non-state actors and supranational actors and structures and processes in world politics. The traditional agenda downgraded ideas and norms to material considerations of power. The new agenda underscores power of ideas and norms. So, if you look at the earlier approaches, you will find that they were only giving importance to the material factors that constituted an important element of state power, but nowadays we are talking of the power of ideas, the power of norms. If you remember the Idea and Vodafone advertisement, you will find that they are giving the advertisement as idea that can change your life. So, that underscores the importance of ideas, the importance of norms in international politics. I can also give some other examples like the rising prominence of religion, human rights, refugees and environment on the agenda of global politics. So, material issues are important like power distribution, like arms race, like military alliances, they are all material issues, but at the same time now we are finding it impossible to ignore these kind of issues like the importance of religion, the role of human rights in foreign policy, refugee issue or the environment issue that define the contemporary agenda of global politics. Now, the furniture of the world is different. Earlier we focused on the state, now we are talking of non-state actors. It also is important to recognize that the understanding of these actors, networks and structures and processes are also changing. So, actors are not seen as defined or fixed objects, but seen as contested objects constructed by a range of material and non-material practices. So, we recognize that the states actors are important, the non-state actors are important, but we also do not recognize that they are all fixed or their numbers are fixed. So, there are maybe hundreds of non-state actors today, but maybe a time will come when there will be several thousand actors and non-state actors. So, this possibility is not ruled out in future. Alterations in ontology of world polity, that is the state to non-state actors, shifted the epistemology of world politics, leading to new theories and approaches to the study of international politics. So, basically when there is a change in the ontology, that earlier we focused on the state actors or interstate interaction, now we are talking of states relationship with non-state actors, the importance of non-state actors enjoying in international politics. We are focusing on the ontology of international relations, and because there is a change in the ontology, so definitely there is a consequent change in the epistemological issues, particularly how we are studying these actors and in what way we are understanding and analyzing international politics. Now, let us focus on the scope of international relations. So, on the basis of the discussion we made so far, we can study the following under the scope of international relations: actors, the role of institutions, structures, processes and particular events or big episodes. But before discussing the role of these actors and institutions under the scope of international relations, let me add two caveats. The first is this demarcation is not fully decided as international situation and disciplines are in a state of flux. We already discussed that at the moment we can talk about the present scope of international politics, but we cannot once and for all fix the scope of international relations on the basis of today's developments or this year's development. Second, the prospect of enlargement of its scope are always there, particularly because it depends on the changes in the global conditions. So, once we agree that okay, this is the scope of the international relations, or these are the actors, institutions and structures that come under the study of international relations, we cannot rule out the possibility that this scope will not be changing in future, particularly as they are dependent on the changes in the global conditions. Now, let me talk about the actors. Now, the actors are entities that make international relations work. We discussed that there are several kinds of actors operating in the international system. There are a variety of actors, and each of these actors, they have their own characteristics, preferences and methods of working that populate the international system. They include state actors and non-state actors like intergovernmental organizations such as the United Nations, non-governmental organizations like the Red Cross, and multinational enterprises like the Microsoft, and the transnational networks of all kinds like Amnesty International or maybe Transparency International, operating along with states in a reconstituted global public domain. So, we have state actors, we have non-state actors, we have international actors, we have intergovernmental actors. So, there are so many actors operating at the international level, and we cannot just focus only on one type of actor. The state centric international system coexists with a decentralized and multi-centric system where global power and authority often gets shared with non-state collectivities. So, gone are those days when we are talking of the exclusive power of the states. Now, as we have discussed, global credit rating agencies, non-state actors like Microsoft, like Apple, like Adani, like Ambani. So, they have become very important, and to a major extent they are also influencing the working of international relations. You cannot understand India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor without understanding the role of Adani and Ambani in it. So, the state economic policies, the state's foreign economic policies are to a great extent influenced by the working of these actors. So, focus may still on nation state system and interstate relations, but actions and interactions of many other groups are now included under the scope of international relations. So, still we consider that we cannot rule out the importance of nation states or the interstate relations. They have become important, they will remain important so long as the present system of international relations is there, but actions and interactions of many other groups, as I discussed, they will be considered as important, and also they are studied under the scope of international relations. Now, let me talk about the importance of international institutions for international relations. They include international institutions, organizations and international regimes to describe different forms of cooperation between countries and the global stage. So, when we are talking of international institutions, it is not just the international institutions, rather under that we can also discuss the role of organizations and international regimes. International institutions refer to formal structures that are created by multiple countries to facilitate cooperation. You can take the example of United Nations or the World Trade Organization, those who have a broad mandate and cover a range of issues. So, international organization like the United Nations is not just focused on international peace and security. It also deals with environmental issues, it also deals with global issues, it also deals with terrorism, it also deals with nuclear proliferation. So, there are so many issues that is dealt by United Nations. Similar is the case about the World Trade Organization. International organizations are more specific in their focus and created to address a particular issue. So, if you compare the international institutions from international organizations, you will find that the international organizations are created for a very specific and limited issue, particularly if you take the example of International Atomic Energy Agency or the International Criminal Court. So, the point is, they have a very narrow objective or agenda. International regimes are sets of rules, norms and procedures that guide interactions between countries on a particular issue, such as climate change, nuclear proliferation or missile control. So, when you look at the international regimes, you will find there are so many at present. You have the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the primary objective of which is to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to non-nuclear weapon states, and you have also the Missile Technology Control Regime, the primary objective of which is to prevent the proliferation of missiles to the non-missile countries, and then you have the Paris Convention that deals with the climate change issue. So, there are different international regimes that are also important along with international institutions and international organizations. They can be formal and informal and can involve multiple international institutions and organizations. So, it is not that international regimes are all formal, they can also be informal. So, this MTCR is not a formal regime. You have this other the Paris Convention, it is an example or it can be an example of a formal regime, but the Missile Technology Control Regime is not a formal example of international regime. Some overlap is there between these terms, but each refers to different aspects of international cooperation that comes under the scope of international relations. So, there may be some overlapping between international organizations or international regimes, but all these institutions come under the scope of international relations. Now, let me focus on the structure that comes under the scope of international relations. Structure may be defined as a set of overarching principles, rules, roles and constraints that bind actors together in a larger world system. It can organize actors into different relative positions of strength, wealth, influence and status. The disintegration of the Soviet Union made the United States as the only superpower, and that created what you can call as the unipolar world, and the present world order is generally characterized as the example of a multipolar world, which India considers as beneficial in comparison to the earlier unipolar world or the bipolar world. So, the structure of international relations may be beneficial for a country or may not be beneficial for another country. Structural pressures can create unintended outcomes by imposing behavioral regularities and outcomes within the system. For instance, geographical influences and historical legacies were the major factors behind India's non-alignment foreign policy. Some views hold that structure primarily consists of material factors such as power distribution, distribution of wealth, etc. Others hold that physical world only acquires meaning and its capacity to influence the behavior through the ideas and understanding of humans. So, there are two different views about the structure of international relations. Some consider material factors as the important factor and others consider the role of ideas and understanding of human beings. For example, structural realism argues that state behavior is determined by the structure of the international system, whereas constructionism emphasizes the salience of norms and ideas in international relations. So, we have two different theories that take two different positions, while we have structural realism given by Kenneth Walters that gave priority to the material factors. So, we have the other theory that is called constructionism that emphasizes the role of ideas and norms in international relations. Overall, the structure and ideas interact and influence each other in the study of international relations. So, neither we can give sole importance to the material factors, nor we can give exclusive importance to the role of ideas and norms. So, if we combine the material factors with the non-material factors, that can help us for a better understanding of international politics, and that is why we consider structures as an important part under the scope of international relations. Now, let me focus on the processes. Processes concern all activities among the states: war, diplomacy, trade, foreign policy and many issues, as well as the relations with and among other international actors such as the intergovernmental organizations, the non-governmental organizations and the multinational companies. So, processes basically focus on the interaction of the states with all the other international actors. While the study of armies, war, weapons are the core concerns of international relations, conflict and peace issues are also areas studied under the discipline. So, we study the traditional agenda along with the contemporary agenda of international politics. Under economic relations, scholars study trade and financial relations, international economic and financial institutions, the North-South dialogue, the South-South cooperation, economic dependency, debt, foreign aid and technology transfer, infrastructure diplomacy like the China's Belt and Road Initiative or India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. So, these issues are all studied under the economic issues. The study of global issues and concerns such as human rights, the environmental issue, terrorism, nuclear proliferation, refugee and migration are also other important areas of study under the scope of international relations. Now, let me focus on the particular episodes. Many of the most significant events in international relations such as wars, coup, revolutions, massive economic depression, economic shocks, pandemics are all called rare episodes. The terrorist attacks on the United States in September 2001 and the US invasion of Afghanistan, China's joining of the WTO and its rise as a leading economic power, financial crisis in 2008 and 2009 and the decline of the American superpower status, India's ascent as a major world power, the rise of social media, Arab Spring, climate change, migration and refugee crisis, COVID and its political, economic and strategic and other effects, the Russia-Ukraine war, demographic crisis and the economic recession in many powerful economies such as Germany and Japan are some of the most dramatic events of the past 20 years, considered both as causes and effects of the underlying trends that have driven world affairs in a variety of ways. So, these are the episodes, these are the important international events that have to a great extent expanded the scope of international relations because of their ability to influence the working of international relations. These type of events occur infrequently, but they are considered as matter of great importance. So, I know COVID has not occurred frequently in the world, but once it happened, you know how it affected the working of the state system, the working of the non-state organizations, the working of country's economy, the working of country's politics, everything was badly affected due to COVID. So, just imagine that period. So, these particular episodes, these are rare, they occur very infrequently, but because of their bigger impact, they are studied and considered as great importance in international relations. In international relations, as in other disciplines, rare events have proven difficult to explain and also to predict, but nevertheless, they are prominently studied under the scope of international relations. So, these particular kind of events, they have proved very difficult to predict because nobody predicted about the end of the Cold War or the disintegration of the Soviet Union, but that happened. So, that proves that these kind of events we cannot study with 100% certainty when these events will occur, how they will impact, but nevertheless we consider these events as important, and under the study of international relations we study the impact of those events. Now, let me focus on some concluding points. So, continuity and change, theory and history, traditional and new agendas define the field of international relations today. So, if you look at these factors what we discussed, that explains and that confirms that continuity and change, theory and history, traditional and new agendas, they have expanded the scope of international relations as we study it today. New agenda doesn't replace or supplant the traditional agenda, it only supplements it. So, we can't say that new agenda has become outdated, it is there, but it is supplemented, it is influenced by the other events also. So, traditional agenda is necessary if not insufficient in understanding or explaining the international relations or global politics today. So, traditional agenda is necessary, we study that, but they may not be sufficient to study under the scope of international relations alone, but if we combine the traditional and the contemporary events, the contemporary issues, then that definitely would give us a comprehensive perspective of the working of international relations today. True, the prevention of war remains as urgent today as it was in 1919, but the character of war has substantially changed since then. Now we are talking of war by non-state actors, we are talking of intrastate wars. So, the nature of war has substantially changed, it is not just limited to interstate war. States are fighting a lot of violent acts by the non-state actors, maybe terrorist organizations. These issues have changed the nature of war. There is cyber warfare, there is spying, there is a different kind of violent engagement by the state actors, by the non-state actors. So, sometimes they are not also visible. So, these kind of changes are captured by the scope of international relations. The expanding scope of international relations lead to the view that the discipline is becoming increasingly unmanageable, but it also lacks a clear conceptual framework. So, there is a concern by some international relations scholars that the scope is expanding, and one day the scope will be so large that it would be really unmanageable to study those under the scope of international relations. It may be clarified that the broad scope may actually be helpful for it, because the varied subject matter may lead to more research and analysis as well as greater specialization within the discipline. So, it is important that we have to recognize that scope has become wider, it has become larger, but at the same time if there are more issues, it is not that this is all studied under the single framework of international relations. There are so many sub disciplines emerged in the broad discipline of international relations. For economic issues, we have international political economy as a sub discipline, we have diplomatic studies. For war and peace issues, we have global governance studies that examines the role of international actors, particularly the United Nations and the Bretton Woods system. So, we have definitely there is a recognition that the scope of international relations has changed, but at the same time we must recognize that there are new sub-disciplines, there are new changes in the discipline that also cannot be overlooked. So, our experience shows that traditional agenda is important, the contemporary agenda is important, and if you combine the traditional agenda with the modern agenda, that gives a better idea of the scope of international relations. So, thank you for your patient hearing.